Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, it just has to be one of the best and most informative books written in my lifetime. And it's not an exaggeration. A lot of people in my audience are probably already familiar with Naomi Klein and her work, especially with The Shock Doctrine. But in The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein perfectly describes the idea of what's called disaster capitalism, which is when there is a time of immense chaos, whether it's from a natural disaster, whether it's from war or economic crisis, whenever there's some sort of calamity going on anywhere in the world, the far right, the economic neoliberals, the ones who worship at the altar of capitalism, they exploit the crisis and use it as an opportunity to push some of the most extreme policies that you could imagine under the cover of the chaos while everybody is reeling from whatever the disaster is. And in the book, she goes through many examples of how this is manifested throughout the decades and how it's was brought about, how it came into fruition from Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. Some of the examples she gives were after that huge tsunami that struck Indonesia, I believe, in the early 2000s. It devastated the country, completely wiped out coastal communities. I think the death toll is over 200,000 people. Neoliberals exploited the situation immediately, and instead of helping these people rebuild their lives after such an incredible disaster, they used it as an opportunity to throw all these people off their lands that they've lived for generations, and to have hotel and resort developers build up their resorts on the land, on the coastal lands where all these people's homes were completely destroyed, completely flattened. They use that as an opportunity to build hotels and resorts. And then you have organizations like the World Bank also exploiting the crisis and giving them money that they desperately needed to rebuild their country and their economy. But instead of giving it to them as grants, they gave it to them in loans with high interest rates that they could never pay back and put them in a permanent state of debt. That's what the neoliberals did. That's how they used disaster capitalism to exploit the crisis after the tsunami in Indonesia in early 2000s. It's happened here in the United States plenty of times. After Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans and Louisiana was completely destroyed from the hurricane and the lack of preparation by FEMA and the state local governments, the Bush administration and the right-wing economic neoliberals, the extremists, they use that as an opportunity to not help the people in New Orleans. They closed 110 out of the 126 public schools in New Orleans and used it as an opportunity to fund and privatize the education system to prop up charter schools and private schools, basically making a for-profit venture for anybody who wanted to build a school and make money in New Orleans. Well, it comes as no surprise to anyone that the neoliberals and the corporatists are using this coronavirus, this global pandemic and economic crisis that we're dealing with here in the United States as an opportunity to exploit the situation for the purpose of disaster capitalism. That's what the CARES Act was. $5 trillion, mostly going to corporations and the richest people in the country. There is no way in hell they could have ever passed something like that had we not been in a state of complete chaos and disarray and complete panic. They used the cover of chaos to push these incredibly unpopular and harmful economic policies that they know the public would be strongly against and in opposition to under any normal circumstance. Well, I have some bad news. It's not going to stop with just the corporate bailouts. They're still coming. They're coming. They're trying to get everything they can possibly take in this dire, unprecedented situation that we're facing. And what's coming next might honestly be worse than the CARES Act. Now they're using the economic crisis to push de facto cuts, sweeping cuts in state and local budgets on a scale that has never ever been seen before in this country. So because of the lockdowns from the coronavirus and everything else that's been going on, so many of the states, basically every single state in this country, has lost some of their main sources of revenue, which is income tax and sales taxes. An unprecedented amount of people have lost their jobs, at least 50 million people at this point. So you're not getting any income tax from them. And then they're also losing on the sales tax because people aren't going anywhere. Businesses were shut down and it's not safe to be out spending money at a lot of these businesses. So they're losing the money that they would get from sales tax revenue. And in some states, like in California, the amount of money, the amount of revenue that they've lost from their annual budget is up to 60%. They've lost 60% of the tax revenue that they use to fund the state and local governments in California. It's not just California. It's not one or two states. NPR has done a great report on this giant budget crisis that every state in this country is facing. And they've compiled the data from literally every single state and break it down in a way that I haven't seen anybody else do. So I'm going to have a link to that. And you can see how big these cuts are in your state and what programs are going to be cut, because that's another part of this. States are going to be forced, they have no choice but to make giant spending cuts because they've lost so much of their revenue. In this NPR report, at least 34 states have lost 20% of their revenue for their annual budget. 20%, just gone. And that number is only going to rise dramatically the longer this crisis continues, because there's still even more people losing their jobs. So that's even less money that they're making from income tax. The longer this goes on, the longer we're going to have to eventually do some other another form of a lockdown, and even they're going to lose even more money from sales tax revenue. So this, as bad as the budget crisis is right now, it's going to get exponentially worse. Before this crisis started, California was making so much off of their tax revenue, they were going to have a $5.6 billion surplus. So after they spent all the money on that was allocated to different government departments, state and local governments, public schools, health centers, after they did all of that, they would have had $5.6 billion surplus, extra money. Now they are going to have a $54 billion deficit. That means instead of having extra money after all the expenses of the government, they're going to come up short $54 billion. And that's money they're going to have to cut from all different types of departments and programs that the government funds. It's hard to wrap your mind around just how drastic and dramatic the cuts to programs like education and healthcare is going to be. Because can you just imagine on any given day before this happened, say the California government just comes out and says, all right, we're just going to cut $54 billion from programs like education, healthcare, park services, mental health services. We're just going to cut $54 billion. We'll find somewhere to cut it. That is unheard of. That would be inconceivable. But that's where they are now. In Florida, where this situation could get out of hand real fast, Florida State has a balanced budget provision, which basically means the state can never have a deficit in their spending. So whatever the tax money whatever money they get from the tax revenue, that's it. That's all they can spend. There is no deficit spending. You can't spend $1 more than whatever the revenue is that the government has. So now, this is like Christmas Day times 10 for the right-wing Republican lunatics in the state legislature here in Florida, who have been hell-bent on cutting as much government spending as possible and trying to privatize everything they can get their hands on. Ron DeSantis just announced they're cutting $200 million in funding that was supposed to go to programs to fund higher education in Florida. $200 million just gone like that at the blink of an eye. How much education was that going to pay for? This is a quote from the governor of Maryland. Quote, responding to this crisis has created a multi-year budget crisis unlike anything the state has ever faced before, more than 3 times worse than the Great Recession. Again, these are just numbers you cannot wrap your head, you cannot fully comprehend. The Great Recession was the worst economic crisis of our lifetime before this happened. It was rivaled to the Great Depression in the scale and the devastation that it brought across the U.S. economy. And for a governor to say this is far worse than what we saw in 2008, it is 3 times worse. The budget crisis is 3 times worse than we saw in 2008. And this is only the beginning. But like I said, the ideologues, the Milton Friedman and the Chicago School and the Ayn Rand Kool-Aid drinkers, they are celebrating this. This is all they've ever wanted in their life. All their dreams come true right now. Because with the cuts to government spending, it incentivizes the private sector to take over the role of government, privatize so many of the essential services that the government provides to local communities. Like I said, a lot of these people are giddy about this. Over 200 state lawmakers across the country signed onto a letter opposing any additional federal funding to go towards bailing out the states that are in a budget crisis. And this is a quote from the letter. Quote, the American people are being forced to make difficult but fiscally responsible decisions during this pandemic, and states need to do the same. Oh boy. So they're encouraging the cuts. They're applauding the cuts. They said, yes, California, cut $56 billion in your annual spending. Cut it from the public schools, cut it from the public health centers, cut it from the environmental services, and just cut it from wherever and anywhere and everywhere. Just cut it. And it shows what so many people on the left have been basically screaming into the void for decades at this point. It's how dangerous it is to have these people. Because it's one thing if you're just an idiot and you make bad decisions from time to time and you are out of step with what your constituents want, and that's one thing. But with a lot of these Republicans and these conservatives and these people who take money from are beholden to these corporations, they have this dogged ideology that is incredibly dangerous, because in situations like this, when there's so much at stake, their priorities are completely backwards. Their priority is, oh shit, corporations, our donors, they can make a fucking killing right now. The charter schools, the private schools that Betsy DeVos has been heralding her entire career, that she's been pushing her entire career. Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, has been on a crusade her entire life to destroy the public education system. So now we're in a situation where states cannot fund public education, and her and all the Republicans who agree with her, they're right on board with it. All right, let's cut dramatically cut funding to public schools, and a lot of them have no choice but to close. And then in comes a wave of for-profit, private and charter schools that basically have no standards for what they teach and who they allow to teach kids. That's going to be the entire education system in the United States. That's what they're pushing for at this time. It's not, oh shit, this is a real crisis. People need help right now. How do we help people? How do we keep things from falling off the rails and completely coming apart at the seams? That isn't going through their mind at all. It's just a whole big money-making operation for them at this point. And like Naomi Klein beautifully describes, they are using the cover of chaos and disarray to do all these right-wing policies that they never could have gotten away with before. And it's a goddamn shame. People have not fully come to terms with our new reality in this country yet. And it's not me being condescending. I don't think I have either. Because this has been such a period of such radical and accelerated crisis that it's just hard to keep up with and to really conceptualize and have a firm understanding of exactly what life is going to be like after this. 40% of all small businesses are about to close in the coming weeks if they haven't closed already. Permanently. 50 million people at least unemployed, and the unemployment benefits have run out, and Congress still has no plan to reinstate it at the levels that it was before. They're trying to cut the unemployment benefits. 28 million people at risk of eviction by October. And then now every single state in this country is dealing with a budget deficit crisis that they've never, ever, on a scale that we've never seen before. This is entirely unprecedented. And this is going to be really, really bad.